Good morning, Dan.
Good morning, Suzanne.
Thanks so much, Radley. Radley led us in our respects to the Sacred Falls this morning and sang a wonderful song and made sure that we each had an offering. And he was reminiscing afterward that one of the rangers in this park, when he first started doing monitoring and the like, said, well, when your people take this park over. And that time is really now, isn't it? So many Native peoples are beginning to to either acquire ownership or control or protective status for sacred places. And a lot of us are still fighting the good fights that will go on for a very long time. But a lot of Native peoples are one by one protecting sacred places in our homelands. And that is something that we really should celebrate and rejoice over. I'm very happy that that is the state. And whether we call agreements with the federal government or with state governments or private entities, co-management or co-stewardship agreements, the important thing is to get sacred places in protected status however we can. We may have to cobble together lots of laws and lots of policies and practices, but we should get that done. But at the same time, we need to forge ahead and get a cause of action in order to defend our sacred places in court, because that's what we lack right now, is an instrument in the law that provides us a door to the courthouse. We haven't had that since 1988 in the Supreme Court ruling in a case called Ling. And that's really known to people in this part of the world because it was through the good efforts of Chris Peters and others who were trying to protect a ceremonial site in Northern California against a Forest Service logging road. And the ceremonial site lost. But it didn't really, because it's still there. It's still going, even though the law went horribly wrong. And the Supreme Court said not only did the American Indian Religious Freedom Act not protect this ceremonial place, but the First Amendment of the Constitution doesn't protect. So that was news to a lot of people who thought that religious freedom was for everyone, and the First Amendment spoke to everyone, to everyone's religions. And why doesn't it speak to ours? Because, as the Supreme Court said, unfortunately, in the first opinion written by a woman on the Supreme Court, a very nasty opinion, it says that the Native American view of the sacred is simply too expansive. So the idea is that if they let us have a way to get into court to protect these places, that we would just take over everything and there would go the neighborhood. Well, we should have thought of that upon their arrival. So that's where the law stands. So since 1988, we've been trying to get a door to the courthouse, and we simply don't have one. Congress has not deigned to build one, and the courts will keep knocking cases back on Indian religious, on efforts to protect our sacred places and to do ceremonies at those places, because most of our ceremonies are site-specific. You have to do it at this place, in this time frame, when the moon is over here and the sun's over there. They're really specific things that you don't just make up from year to year. These things have been decided for millennia. So our people need to be able to have the same kind of protections in our sacred places that non-native people have for their churches everywhere in America. And every other religious person in the United States of America has the ability to get into court and stay into court and win. We don't. We're the only ones who do not. So that's an important thing for America to understand, and for us to keep telling them and repeating it, because people don't really understand that we're without that door to the courthouse, or everyone has a door to the courthouse but Indians, that no, you can't come in here when it comes to protecting sacred places. So we're trying to get that cause of action. We've been trying to get it. With every push, sometimes it doesn't matter that you don't achieve something right away, because every time you call attention to the problem, a few other sacred places get protected. So that's the importance of making national pushes, making pushes for statutory relief, is that sometimes some will slip through and get protected and stay protected. So when Pitt River takes over the Falls Park, or enter into a co-management or co-stewardship agreement, they should look to Cochiti Pueblo, for example, that has a very good co-management agreement with one of the federal agencies, and that's Cochiti Pueblo for the protection of Kachakatue, which is Tent Rock's National Monument. Very beautiful place, just off a highway in New Mexico between Albuquerque and Santa Fe. The important thing about that agreement is that Cochiti Pueblo, without explanation, without prior announcement, without any notice, can close the entire area and have the federal agency close it because it's needed for whatever purposes they need it for. Usually something pretty serious and ceremonial. But they don't have to say what it is. They don't have to plan in advance. And the people have just gotten used to, the public have just gotten used to going to Tent Rocks, and if it's closed for that day or that 2-day period, they come back. They understand. So people all around that area and tourists from all around the world respect that Cochiti Pueblo needs to have ceremonial closure, needs to have privacy in order to conduct their religious doings, whatever they may be. So that's the big deal. That's the kind of agreement that is worth entering into with a federal agency or with a state agency or with private people, where you're not beholden to them, you don't have to announce your presence and the like. When the civilization regulations were put in place in the United States without law, no underlying law. I mean, whenever you have regulations, you're supposed to have a law that goes before, but this was no law, no policy, just straight to regulations by the Secretary of the Interior, outlawing all religious ceremonies of Indians and so on and so forth. They just criminalized and everything that made Indians Indians. It was during that period where, as the regulations say, there was no roaming off the reservation. It was a criminal offense to do that without a hall pass from the Indian agent. Anything, so people couldn't go to the nearby sacred place that was just off reservation that they thought had been reserved in treaties or before they were confined to the reservations for that long period. And anything that was outside of the reservation was declared surplus to the Indians' needs because the Indians weren't using it. Well, of course, they didn't tell anyone that Indians were confined to the reservations. And all of those sacred places were taken into the public domain. So what I think ought to happen with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the section about an assessment of sacred places and whether or not they were taken by with the free, prior, and informed consent of the peoples, that the president ought to issue some sort of mechanism, an executive order or whatever kind of directive, to each of the land managing agencies and ask them how it is they acquired these sacred places. You know, name the sacred place, name that's under your jurisdiction, Agency X, and give us a report on the free, prior, and informed consent that was provided by the people in order for you to gain jurisdiction over that site. So that's one thing. Wouldn't that be a heck of a report? I would love to see that report. And that's something that you could use nation by nation as a form of true consultation with the federal agencies about what do you do now? You have jurisdiction over this. We didn't give our free, prior, and informed consent. So now what? I think that's one way of getting around the fact that we don't have a door to the courthouse. So I wanted to begin with those few thoughts and turn this over to my partner here, my Mascogee brother, Chaban Dr. Wildcat, and to ask him if he would also talk about the work that he's doing related to sacred places, and then we're going to have kind of a conversation and a question and answer with each other. And if you would like, we would go to your questions as well.
Absolutely.
But we thought it was better to break this up into small parts than just take a long time to speak. Dr. Cat.
Yes. Well, thank you, Suzanne. And first of all, I want to thank the organizers of the Protect Mother Earth Justice Summit for the invitation to be here. I want to tell you how honored I am to be here in the homeland of the bands of the Pitt River Indians. It is an honor to be here. And I think the work that you're doing here is really indicative of what we're going to have to do across what is euphemistically called Indian country. So let me sort of sketch out the kinds of things following on exactly what Suzanne said. I think, getting, that in the door of the courthouse, making sure that, we can gain that legal standing and be able to put forth the really important arguments, the defense of sacred lands that need to be made today. I think there's a lot of things that are around that, strictly speaking, that this summit is a good example of and that we need to continue. And I'll say a little bit about the work I've been doing. So for about the last 8 years, many of you probably know most of my work has been really dealing with what I would call native peoples and native homelands and really the catastrophic impacts of climate change that indigenous people are facing. Not just in North America, not just in the continental North America, the contiguous 48 states, Alaska, and Hawaii, but all over the planet. We are seeing that the people who bear the most immediate impacts and the brunt of climate change are indigenous peoples. This is primarily the case because even in the midst of the kind of society that we're sitting in right now, the larger society, I think the power of indigenous peoples resides in the fact that we never made the misstep of thinking somehow that who we were as peoples and our cultures, our life ways, our names, our ceremonies, our practices, our food, could in any way ever be separated from those beautiful landscapes and seascapes, really from which we emerged as unique peoples. I think the way that we need to put forward education, not just for our own peoples and our grandchildren and our children, but for the larger societies of the planet, nations of the planet, is to remind people that those possessing the most unrealistic and romantic view of the natural world are not indigenous peoples. Those who have the most romantic, unrealistic view of the world are those who reside in the center of Western civilization, who think somehow humankind is in control of the planet. There's no greater mythology than that one. The environmental crises we see, the climate change we see today on the planet is directly tied to that mythology. Suzan has probably done more work than anyone else to really think how we work through the primary institutions of the legal system, of the political system. And I'm not talking about our own, but the larger political and legal systems of the United States of America, so that we can advance our views and defend the places that are important to us for our continued survival. And it's been a struggle. It has been a tremendous struggle. But in the work that I've been doing in the last 8 years, almost a decade now, really focusing most of my work on climate change and its impacts on Native people, there's something that I think we need to be very mindful of, and I'm glad that this body here is sort of, again, indicative of that. And that is that there are increasing numbers of people who are very distantly and for a long time removed from their sense of being indigenous or tribal peoples. People, the members of the mainstream population, who are beginning to realize that something is just not right. And I think that we have the potential for building incredible allies in this renewed effort to really seek legal protection of sacred sites. I think those allies are people who are beginning to recognize. I think I can't remember. I know this is the attribution that's made. It's often said that Einstein said this. Einstein obviously said a lot of really important things, but I think the attribution's kind of been called into question. It really doesn't matter, but the idea is that we cannot fix the problems that we're facing with the same kind of thinking that created the problems. And I think we've got an opportunity now. In fact, I'd go a step further. I'd say, Suzan, and I think you'd agree, I think now what we're beginning to do is recognize that indigenous peoples have a responsibility to stand up, to humbly speak for those relatives. I guess it was Oren Lyons who first said it when he first visited the United Nations. Who will speak for the eagle? Who will speak for the bear? Who will speak for the deer? I'm here to humbly represent them. And I think that there's nothing romantic about that at all, or unrealistic. I think the issue that we face today is that, and this is a question, we can immediately get into, I think, a nice exchange about, some of the things that we need to be doing. So let me take that last point, that, why we're speaking and what we're doing here. And I would argue to you that within many of our tribal traditions, the oldest political traditions of our own peoples, that while we certainly had a grand appreciation for rights, those were always co-balanced with an equally important notion that we are possessors and inheritors of inalienable responsibilities. And so what we're doing today here is exercising really our inalienable responsibilities that we have to protect landscapes, seascapes that are threatened today by people who've forgotten that we might be best served if we would move from a worldview that looked at the balance of all of this life that surrounds us, this other than human life, as relatives as opposed to resources. Resources are easy to manage, some think, and easy to control. But to have a relationship is a very different thing. At least I think in our families, you don't go managing your relatives. If you think you're going to do that, you're going to get in trouble real quick. And so I would put forward to you that we have a great opportunity. Let's explore what a discussion about our human place in this beautiful life system of the planet, of our Mother Earth, would be like if we moved from systems exclusively preoccupied with rights to one that affirmed inalienable human responsibilities to the balance of life that surrounds us. Then moved from a discussion about management of resources to respect for relatives, other than human relatives, that our communities, our life depends on. And I think then, we're going to have a lot of people that might be very interested in joining a discussion. And the discussion would go like this. Maybe the problem we need to start thinking about is not one of how we're going to continue the kind of, the standard of living and the way of life that, Americans seem to so highly value, and get it caught up into some notion of how are we going to reproduce this? How are we going to sustainably reproduce this? But rather raise that question, maybe it's time to try something different, because what we have clearly isn't working. And I think there we have the opportunity to move from a discussion about reproduction of existing systems to creating some indigenous-based systems that I would call resilient in a very meaningful way. Resilient in the sense that in the kind of world we have lived today with incredible uncertainty, that what we need is to draw on the strengths of our ancestors who understood that it's not all about us here, and that we do have responsibilities and intellectual inheritance, a cultural, a spiritual inheritance to draw on that might just give us the opportunity to find that system of thinking, the one that's not responsible, as far as I know. It's not Mascogee, it's not Zoyaha, it's not Passamaquoddy, it's not Pequot, it's not Coast Salish, ideas that have created the kind of world we're immersed in. Those ideas, those systems were challenged, interrupted by a 500-year history now of colonialism. And now that a great many people are beginning to see that, the dominant ways of thinking have produced quite a mess, I think there are people who might be willing to listen to articulate indigenous people, young people, that are here in this audience who are going to be preparing themselves to stand up and articulate a different way of thinking that might help us not only protect sacred sites on this planet, but value the incredible cultural diversity that once existed on this planet, a cultural diversity that was directly tied to the biological, environmental, and ecological diversity of the planet, because we never separated ourselves from the natural world and those relatives that gave us life. So it's an honor to be here, because I think, you know, in terms of, you know, how we move, Suzan, from, you know, this discussion, you know, about rights and responsibilities and resources to relatives. I'd like to kind of get your thought. I mean, am I being overly optimistic, or what do you think the opportunity for you know, us finding those allies who will kind of join us in these kinds of discussions? I think we've got good people now who are ready with the to put forward the kinds of political and legal actions we need to. We just need to keep pushing. You know, we'll keep, you know, banging on that door and get into the courthouse. I think we can really move that forward if we keep doing these kinds of convenings and explore indigenous thinking about these ideas, that we have something really significant to contribute. Do you see those allies out there?
Oh, I do. I see a whole world full of allies and potential allies. Our peoples worked out these things across cultural lines, across religious lines, across national lines, to such an extent that the only rule at Bear Butte, for example, and I'll switch to my Cheyenne side now. I spent a lifetime trying to figure out what's Mascogee and what's Cheyenne. Our Cheyenne people aren't the only ones who go to Bear Butte in South Dakota. We call it Nawawu's Holy Mountain. And there are at least 59, literally, other Native nations who use Bear Butte for religious and cultural purposes. And the only rule, the only law, is that you leave your weapons at the bottom before you go into that territory. And then it's up to you. There are certain areas that are definitely a Cheyenne commemorative area or an observance area for Lakotas or for Assiniboines or Arapahoes, and on and on and on. And to understand that kind of system that relies on a holy place, on a sacred place, you need to understand what a sacred place is. It is a commemorative site or an observance site or a place where something is done, vision questing, or where something is celebrated, the passage of from one part of your life to another part of your life, the emergence into womanhood, the emergence into manhood, the change of a name, the change of a time where you've had tremendous loss. All of these things are done at sacred places, but most of all, a sacred place is a place where good people with pure motives go to pray for the good day. What a wonderful thing that is. And for everyone, to pray for the good day, to pray for the rain. People make jokes about us being able to bring the rain, but that is what some of our people do, is bring the rain where it's needed, and to make sure that the sun shines, and to be thankful for all of these things, and to instill in our young people that things will move in an orderly manner as long as we don't interfere and as long as we remember to be grateful, as long as we remember not to put barriers in the way of Mother Earth doing her job and all the other creatures, all the other peoples we share the world with do their job. So we just have to figure out what is our place, what is our responsibility, what do we need to do where. Everyone knows their duty in a certain place. Now, just a little bit of history. When George Armstrong Custer heard about leaving the weapons at the bottom of Holy Mountain at Bear Butte as a show of disrespect for Native traditions, he plowed his horse into a really important area with all his weapons. And we know what happened to him. That is what some companies and some employees of some federal agencies are doing right now. They're being the Custers. They're deliberately, as a sign of disrespect and of disregard, and to show how little they think of us and how much they want to dominate us, to make us do what they want us to do. They just move into a place with a great show of force, more than is needed, and start constructing things that are against their own interest. They want to make such a show of this demeaning activity that they're not even behaving in a way that benefits their stated goals. So we're fighting this kind of aberrant mentality and behavior, and the people who most need to be at these places and be protected along with the places are the least equipped to fight those fights themselves.
Right, yeah. I think it's a really good point, and I think, I appreciate, the reference to, the way often we are in a face-off often, standoff with sometimes federal agencies over these issues, and sometimes it seems like the only response that federal agencies know is one of, extreme show of force, and I think that one of the things that is really important for us to keep in mind is that as we think about how we are going to deal with this aberrant behavior, aberrant thinking, is that in meetings such as this and all of the incredible convenings that are going on all over the planet today, is that we, in the way that we do our business and conduct our affairs, try to model a very different way of behaving. And I think that's, again, another very valuable thing. I know if you think about it, we live in a world today that seems, interestingly, maybe it's predictable, where all of the major conflicts are about resources, very directly, or religion. And I keep thinking about this because your example of how Bear Butte was used. And we could name a dozen other sites, and there are probably sites here in the Shasta Mountains that would be relevant. Used by many peoples, used by many bands. And there were never wars fought over those sites, I'll bet. Never wars fought over those sites. And I think that speaks to something that's very, very powerful. And that's the fact that as we're trying to get in that door of the courthouse, as we're trying to raise public awareness about the kinds of issues that really everyone on the planet is facing today, is that it's not just what we say, it's not just, the position papers and the declarations that we write, but that we continue to try to model a way of coming to agreement, as I think the Haudenosaunee would say, come of one good mind about something. Oh, don't worry, we may have some, knockout, drag-down fights before we get to that of one good mind. I'm not saying we all just come together and are happy all the time. We have strong feelings about things. But we used to create spaces, and maybe this is part of this issue, isn't it? About it's not just this sort of inability to acknowledge or sense the sacred in the world that's around us right here and now. It's the fact that even in those institutions that are very much shaped by human intention and motivation, we've pushed the sacred out of those. The dominant society has. But I think when you go to the roundhouse, when you go to the longhouse, when you go to the council house, when you go to the kiva in indigenous traditions, and you have those traditional political discussions, even those spaces are acknowledged as filled and imbued with the sacred. And how you conduct yourself is tempered by that. So I think, it's kind of interesting. Listening to Suzan talk and watching all the work she's done, I think, so here's what I'd suggest, and I'd like to get Suzanne's response. There is plenty of work for everyone to do, okay? There's plenty of work. So what we ought to do is create an Indigenous Jobs Program, okay? And the Indigenous Jobs Program is we're going to start training teachers, social workers, environmental scientists, lawyers, political leadership, engineers, entrepreneurs, that all undertake their life's work without any thought that they could do that life work without an acknowledgement of that sacred powers, the powers that surround us. Doesn't matter what you're doing. And I think Suzanne's a good example of a person, and I don't want to put her on the spot here, but I'm going to call her out. There aren't a lot of Indians I know who live in the Beltway that I trust to speak about, with heart and with spirit, about Native issues. But it can be done because Suzan Harjo's been there for a long time doing it. And what that tells me is that the issues that we face are sometimes as much a product of our own sort of getting trapped in this notion of well, we can't do this. We can't do this. The system won't let us. The school won't let us. The businesses won't let us. Well, I tell you what, if we have our own schools, if we have our own businesses, if we conduct business the way we do, then no one can tell us we can't, except ourselves. And I think that's something we need to talk about. Sometimes I think we can kind of convince ourselves that there's not much really that we can do.
Well, absolutely. And I like the idea of sort of an Indigenous jobs bulletin. Anyone who wants to help and wants to be an ally, contact anyone who's going to speak today, or Dan or myself.
Uh-oh.
We'll have
How many people are
ideas.
going to see this? What are you trying to do to me?
Well, contact Dan. And, and there's plenty to do, and
Right.
there are so many sacred places right now that are under threat and under siege, and it's no wonder that a lot of times we behave like we're under siege, because
Right.
we are. There are people who are militating against us and who are forcing us into a court situation where they know that we will probably ultimately lose. And if we can't get into court through the environmental laws or any of the other kinds of laws that aren't intended necessarily for the protection of sacred places, then the people will just say, well, so sue us.
Yeah, yeah,
You don't have a place at the table, sue us. Knowing that we can't
right.
easily, and we can't broadly. So so if we can't get into the courts and Congress isn't making any new doors to the courthouse, let's do other things, let's figure out other ways to deal with this. And at the same time, we should be having a lot of meetings in Washington with these federal agencies' bosses in Washington. The ones who are oftentimes the worst are the ones who are in the local areas, who are trying their best to provoke Native people into negative action, and who are trying to keep at the same time us from the positive action that we have when we go to sacred places and when we do the things that we're supposed to do there, because we feel good about it, and it betters the world. So these are some of the things that we can teach the federal agencies how to do things in our own sacred places. We know these places. We understand the terrain. A recent example, over the past few years, at Mount Graham in Arizona, a really holy place for the Apache people, and of course the sponsors of the telescopes, the Columbus telescopes at Mount Graham, I know, which were the Vatican and the Forest Service, and a bunch of others who have dropped off now. They say that the place isn't sacred. Well, it's not sacred to them. It's sacred to the Apaches, but they don't acknowledge that. So here are the Apaches trying to protect Mount Graham for a lot of reasons, very important place, and they're trying to protect the little red squirrel who lives no place else. So here comes the great Forest Service with everything at its disposal, and the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they build a trap, a feeding trap for the squirrel, so that they will increase the population. But in order to get the food in this little feeding trap, and trap is the proper word, the squirrel's head goes in and the rest of its body is out, and so hawks just come down, and so it becomes a feeder for the hawks, of the endangered red squirrel. Now, any native child could have told them, this isn't going to work. This is going to hurt this little red squirrel. So that's the kind of thing that gets done with all our taxpayer dollars against the Indian interest, against the interest of our relatives at these sacred places, and ruins the whole system for everyone, that the whole ecosystem of a sacred place, because it's not, as you pointed out earlier, not just the human beings. They're the medicine plants, they're everything that this feeds on that, feeds on this, doesn't bother this over here. And everyone gets along and gets, as long as you remember the little basic rules, which basically is do no harm.
Right, right. Well, I think we probably might want to open this up to people, to the audience for questions or comments. I mean, you don't want to let us go on too long. We can, we push play and we can go 3 hours, for like some sort of seminar or something. But I know we have limited time, but I'd love to questions, thoughts anyone has. Radley's got a microphone back there. Yeah. Right up here, Radley.
All right. So legally, how would you go about staking a religious claim over a certain piece of land?
Legally,
Well, one way is to do it with your own tribal authority. And what I would suggest is to have a declaration of cultural property. The Apaches came together in 1994 or 95 and did this very thing for all the Apache people, and it was for protection of certain sacred places and for repatriation purposes, so that one wouldn't get played off against the other in making repatriation claims and trying to recover living objects and Apache relatives and the like. So making a tribal declaration of cultural property is one thing, and you could make it in a comprehensive way or do it about one sacred place. So that's one way of doing it. And at one point, I had gotten the agreement from the people at the Library of Congress and the Patent and Trademark Board and the Federal Trade Commission about protection of intellectual property, but I think we've lost so much in the name of intellectual property that it's good to change the lexicon, just change the language and call it cultural property. And that goes to your tribal name, your history, this is all your cultural property, as well as a place, and go from there. So that's one kind of thing that can be done, and the only caution I would make is that to include in such a declaration that that these are examples, and this isn't the definitive list. These are just some of the things that that you're declaring at the time, and that these are yours since time immemorial, not since the date that you issue this. So with those cautions, I would go ahead and everyone just right away issue a declaration of cultural property and move from there. Now, some sacred places and are under such siege that that time has sort of passed, but
right.
not necessarily with every agency. Do it with other agencies that you're not in mortal, hand-to-hand combat with.
I think the key to that, and I'll give a kind of a same principle but a different context. So you don't wait for anyone to grant you this. You exercise your sovereignty, your people's sovereignty, your nation's sovereignty, and make these declarations, and you create these documents. Now, at the least, what it ensures is at that point, when you're having discussions with a federal agency, now and you raise the issue with them, they have to meet with you and talk about this, because this is the mandate now that, all the federal agencies are going to recognize this nation-to-nation kind of relationship and are compelled to do that. I'll give you sort of a very similar kind of thing we did at Haskell Indian Nations University. We've been fighting our own sacred land issue on our university for the last at least 22 years, and it's with something called the South Lawrence Trafficway, a trafficway that was proposed to be built right across the Wakarusa wetlands, which was part of the Haskell campus until about 40 years ago. And then that land was declared surplus and turned over to a small private university, Baker University, in Kansas. And that land had been set aside for the education of Indian children, was a part of Haskell, declared surplus, and through a lot of shady maneuvering, ended up in the hands of Baker University. We still claim responsibility for that, obviously, of that land and caretaker responsibilities. And so when the permitting, the required NEPA, National Environmental Protection Act, permitting was required, they have to do, an environmental impact statement, the people who wanted to build the trafficway. They did, and when we were provided, Haskell Indian Nations University was provided a copy. It had absolutely, I think, maybe 2 sentences in the whole EIS about Haskell. 2 sentences. And we challenged it. We said, hey, your environmental impact statement is flawed, insufficient, and it gave us the gave us the opportunity to argue one thing they had not considered was the sacred nature of the land, and we did. So we put forth they had, by the way, we forced them to do a supplemental environmental impact statement, an SEIS, and in it we made that argument. And then guess what? They had to address that. So it's sort of a way, if we take these actions, it gives you a chance to bring these issues into the courthouse. This actually, the issue of the SEIS actually ended up going to court. So anyway, in principle, I think, you just make these challenges, create these documents, declarations, and then those become the avenue through which you start to stand on those with federal agencies and the government to say, hey, we have to talk about this.
And if anyone's interested in giving you any land, or giving you a permanent easement on land, they can get a write-off for doing that if they construct it in such a way that it's a cultural easement and a gift. So there are things like that to explore as well. Another huge thing is we just have to educate more and more and more of our own people about the importance of these things. And right now, the Muscogee Nation and Hickory Ground are facing in court the Porch Band of Indians, of Creek Indians in Alabama, who are building a casino on top of Hickory Ground, the historic Hickory Ground, Wetumpka, Alabama, which was the last capital prior of Muscogee Confederacy prior to the forced removal by Andrew Jackson of most of the Muscogees to Indian Territory in the 1820s and 1830s. So not only is it a historic place, it's a sacred place, it's a ceremonial place, it's a burial ground, and it has individual burial sites. Even knowing this, and especially knowing it, the Porch Band, which only received federal recognition in 1984, and which was supported by a lot of us because they were pitiful. We wanted to help them, and then this is the turnaround. They promised to protect this area, and even though they had alternatives, even though they have other casinos, they are building it right on top of hickory ground, which is such a desecration to our people. And I hope that people will really take note of that and see that people are calling it an Indian against Indian fight. It's not. It's an Indian against developer fight. And the porch band people say it's because Hickory Ground and Muscogee Nation are somehow against gaming, which isn't the case. But Muscogee Creek Nation has a whole lot of casinos, and there are nations all over the country who have, Native nations all over the country who have casinos, and they aren't being built on sacred places. So this is a horrible desecration by our own people who have been raised up in the same education system that most non-Indians have been raised in, that have brought us this kind of ignorance. Here, though, it's more than ignorance. It's people acting with malice and forethought.
Thank you, Suzan, and Dr. Wildcat is my, is it on? Okay. I appreciate you, what you're sharing. I respect you both. Dr. Wildcat, this is over at Haskell Indian Nations University, and I really respect his work, and just so honored that you could make it here, and be flexible with us and understand, as my aunt was saying when she got started, and how life is, and how some things haven't changed, but it does change with us as we grow and share with one another, make us strong.